Hello and welcome to Connect Group. I am Senior Pastor Timothy Wisnat of the First Church campuses. Can you believe it? We are almost in November. It's the second installment of our fall semester of Connect Group. I want to thank you so much for joining with us tonight, whether you're a guest, welcome, or you are a member of the First Church campuses. We are so glad that you are here. I'm coming to you today from Bangkok, Thailand. We are concluding today our missions trip both to the Philippines and to Thailand, where in the Philippines we dedicated the Paul R. Price School of Theology, and what a tremendous time we had there. Brother Garza was able to go on this trip and be along and minister and got to see what God is doing in the Philippines. And then I came over here to Thailand to meet with Pastor Steve Cabeson and the International Apostolic Church of Thailand. Met with the leaders for several hours yesterday and then this morning, and we'll be headed home in just a few hours, and hopefully we'll see you. Maybe I'm there with you right now. So today we're going to deal with one of, if not outside of Jesus Christ himself, if not one of the most prominent characters in the Word of God, and that is King David. And you can think to yourself, how could I ever relate to a king? You know, when Bill Gates has a bad day, I have a hard time relating to someone having a bad day when they've got billions of dollars in the bank. But you see, you can't think of David as only King David, because he didn't start there. He started as a very blue-collar, lower-class family. They were sheep herders and sheep gatherers and salt of the earth type people. They worked by the sweat of their brow. They lived hand to mouth. David knew what it was like to hear his parents have conversations about, are we going to have enough food to last us through the winter? And you know, the price of sheep is down, and I don't know how we're going to make it until the next market day. David was familiar with that. He lived in a very lower class, blue-collar type home. So when we think of David and his kingship and we think of his power, we must remember that he came from very humble beginnings. And so there is a lot that we can relate to. I want to paint a picture both of young David and King David, both in his power and success, and his weakness and his vulnerability, both when he was famous and at times infamous, and when he was unknown to everyone, seemingly his own family, but not to God. David was a young man whose heart was fixed on God from a very, very young age, playing his harp in the pasture by himself. He seemed to be a bit of a loner, but he wasn't totally an introvert. He learned how to adapt to being around people. Most of his upbringing was him with a harp, just playing around the wilderness of the Judean hills and singing songs to the Lord, love songs of great, deep affection and worship to God, and watching sheep. He was thought of very lowly by his own family. Sure, that triggered within him some sort of inferiority complex, that his own dad didn't even think enough of him to acknowledge him as a son before the prophet. These things stuck with young David. But one thing that also stuck with David, through his insecurities, through his weaknesses in his flesh and his spirit, his mind, his life, his character, one thing remained constant in David's life, and that was his love for God. Now, in David's life, we won't see an exact parallel to the prophet Elijah, where there were tremendous swings of emotion, victory on the mountaintop, praying for death under a tree. We don't see that quite dramatic swing, but what we do see is times of incredible chaos in his life, when it seems like his life is going to end on multiple occasions, but God snatches him out of the jaws of death many times and places him in a place of prominence or preeminence. I think of the time that David is going to the battlefield to fight a giant by the name of Goliath. And this is going to be very important when I end this lesson, that David kills Goliath, and And then he celebrates that victory by going to the house of God, going to church, going to the temple, if you would. Now, David had a great affinity for the temple because Jewish law stated that if a man violated God's law, the law of Moses, to the seventh generation, they could not enter the temple. And David was that eighth generation of the line of the household of Jesse. And so David was allowed to go to the temple, he and his brothers, for the first time in 7 generations. And so that's why David would write, I was glad when they said unto me, let us go to the house of the Lord. It seems like both David's tragedies and his triumphs, there is one constant backdrop in his life, and that is an affinity for God's house. You see, David was anointed by God to be king as a teenager. And then he was thrust from the pasture to the palace, from watching sheep to the politics of the king's court. And God's spirit had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit came upon him. He was tormented. He was miserable. He was having psychotic episodes, being tormented by an evil spirit. He threw a knife at David to try and murder him. Could you imagine? David knew he was going to be king, and Saul knew that David was going to be king. David was waiting around in Saul's opinion like some anointed vulture to pick the flesh from his carcass when he died and inherit the kingdom. But Saul had a son by the name of Jonathan, whom, like any father, wanted his child, his son, to inherit the kingdom, to become king. And it drove him mad. There's a unique relationship that develops between Jonathan and David at a very, very young age, and they grow up to be like brothers. They love one another. They have a friendship and a fidelity to one another that's almost unparalleled in the Bible. And they love one another. And Jonathan realizes his place in the kingdom. And he's okay with that, but his father's not. Can you imagine being some very young, very innocent, bright-eyed young man walking into the courts and the palace of the great King Saul? Not only was he wealthy, not only was he powerful, but yet he was head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the kingdom. He was a towering giant of a man himself. And he goes from where everything is simple in the shepherd life to the controversies, the woes, the politics, the manipulation, the scheming of the courts of the king. Everything was turned upside down. And in this time, we find David writing Psalms where his heart is being poured out to God. He doesn't know how to handle this. The man that he loves, King Saul, that he honors as God's anointed, wants him dead, outright trying to murder him himself through sending David on suicide missions. Much to his demise, much to his regret, David comes back alive. And it angers Saul even more when they walk through the streets. You have to imagine this. Saul knows David's going to be king. How many ever years it's going to be? Could you imagine working a job not where your boss retired, but where the person ahead of you is fired in disgrace, but the company says we're going to keep him around for a year and you need to shadow them and learn everything you can? Can you imagine the awkwardness of that? Now put that on a scale 1,000 times more. And this is the awkwardness of which David is living in, and Saul don't want anything to do with him. But David, like a wide-eyed, innocent puppy, is following him around and excited to inherit the kingdom and genuinely pure of heart. When they walk down the streets, the young maidens, no longer does Saul catch their eye, but it's young David. And they sing songs. Saul hath killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands, as they threw flowers and showered him with wreaths and praised his feats. You see, Saul sent David to the Philistines to be killed, David, anointed by God, conquered, and it ended up backfiring every time on King Saul. Saul put a hit on David. David ran for his life. David ran for his life knowing that the king was coming after him. And the first place, after he had ran for many hours without stopping, he goes into the temple. The priest recognizes him, and Ahimelech says, "What are you doing here?" David, out of breath and sweating, he says, "Well, the king's business was of such haste, I had to run. Do you have anything I can eat?" The priest says, we have holy bread. If you have kept yourself from immorality and sin, you can partake of it." David eats the bread and he feels strength, and he feels like he can go on, but not to fight his king, but just go on to survive. And he looks at David, and seeing that David is running, knowing something's up, David looks at Ahimelech the priest and says, "Well, do you have any weapons here?" And Ahimelech looked at David and somewhat rebuked him and said, "What do you think this is, an armory? This is the house of God. We don't keep weapons here." However, wrapped up in the linen ephod back there is Goliath's sword, the giant you slew. You can take that and leave. David grabbed the bloodstained blade of Goliath and took off running, knowing that there were assassins hot on his heels, and he runs to the city of Gath, the place that David was from, that Goliath was from. Everyone knew David as the giant killer. He had killed their champion. And we find David at the gates of Gath, taking Goliath's sword and scrabbling it upon the walls and chopping it upon the gates and slobbering on himself. And he fiended himself like a crazy man, to which the king of Gath, Achish, looks at David and says, "Have you come to kill all of us?" And David says, "No, I just need sanctuary." So Achish, the king of Gath, hires David as a mercenary, hires him as a soldier of fortune, as a personal bodyguard to the Philistine king. And David and his disgruntled men became men, warriors, as Saul hunted him like an animal. David never raised his fist to God's anointed. He never raised his sword. As a matter of fact, David slipped into a cave in the dark of night where Saul was, and he cut off the end of his garment and stood to the other side of the cave and held it up and said, "I could have killed you, but that's not God's will." You see, David knew his role, and he knew that it wasn't always going to be like this. God has promised things in my life, and just because things are bad, I don't give up. I don't throw in the towel. I don't say, "I don't want any of this king business and get me out of this." No, David knew, I can trust in the Lord, and I've got to keep doing what's right. No matter what, I need to do what's right. Fast forward to the time that David's on the throne. Saul is long dead. He's still grieving the loss of both his king and his best friend Jonathan. But never in the history of Israel has there been a greater warrior king than David. David has the greatest of affinity from the people of Israel to this day of any other king. David was a conqueror. David was a mighty man of war. And something happened. Something happened in David's life, whether it was the tragedy of the death of a child, or the moral failure which he brought upon himself, or great victories over vast armies. One thing remained constant in the backdrop of David's life: tragedy, triumph, grief, or gift. I want to be in the house of God. You see, there has to be something within us that says, I belong in God's house. I know that in 2022, especially in a post-COVID world, that church and being in the house of God has become even more optional than ever before to the people of God. But to the people who are called of God and filled with the Spirit, they understand, I like David, have a burning passion in my soul. I need to be in God's house because all hell is breaking loose. I want to be in God's house with God's people. There's politics, there's conniving, there's scheming, there's everything out here. I just want to be in the sanctuary with God's people, worshiping God in the beauty of holiness. I just want to be in his presence. David found himself like that all of his life. He just wanted to be in the temple. He just wanted to be a worshiper in the house of God. We have got to pray. We have got to reignite that within ourselves. I see so many people across our world today in 2022 where church is becoming more and more optional to them. Well, Pastor, I can be blessed in my home, or Pastor, God understands. I can pray in my car. And all of those things are true, but what is not true is that God understands or excuses that, because this is something he set forth even in the New Testament when Paul wrote and said to not forsake the assembly of ourselves together. Why? Because there's strength in God's house. There's power in God's house. There's comfort and joy in God's house. I'm sure sitting around you, whether you're at a restaurant, a coffee shop, or a living room, someone can tell you of a time when their flesh in their body, they were too tired. They didn't want to go to God's house. They didn't want to go to church. They were exhausted. They were stressed. They just got bad news. But they pushed on and they went anyway. And inevitably, God spoke to them, or God touched them in a unique and a powerful way. I can remember just a few years ago when I lost my mother, I was so anxious to get to church, to be with the people of God, to be with you, because there's so much solace, joy, and peace in God's presence with God's people. You see, it's not the same as rejoicing over victories from the battlefield by yourself. David said, bless the Lord with me. Let us magnify his name together. He wrote that in Psalms 34 as a call to worship. He had just won a great victory. You see, defeat or triumph, we belong together. There's strength being together. There's strength and worshiping the Lord together in God's house. I ask you, and I know this is Connect Group, and maybe the tenor of this devotion is a little different than the mainstream of our devotions in Connect Group, but let me ask you something and be honest. Question yourself now. Do I find myself more often not wanting to be with God's people in God's house? Do I find myself looking for excuses to not be there? If so, you're not broken. You're just dealing with life. And you've got to grab life by the horn, so to speak. Take your flesh to the house of God and to the altar, and let God renew you upon the altar of commitment. Let God restore your soul. Let God turn it around for you. When I get home, and I can only speak to me, but when I get home from trips or vacations or whatever, I can't wait to get to God's house. I often will drive by the church on the way home just because I want to see it. I want to be near it. Because that's the place that we have committed to be God's house, where the people of God come together and worship and love the Lord in unity and in the beauty of holiness. And I will close with this. Remember how I said that David took Goliath's sword to the house of God? Well, that became the MO of David. After every great triumph in defeating the many armies that he defeated, he never let the spoil of war go to the people, not of the weaponry. He took it and hid it in the house of God. And many decades after his death, there would be a wicked queen by the name of Athaliah who would murder her own son and try to murder her grandson, Joash, and to cut off the lineage that would bring Christ, the Messiah, into the world. But the priests took that baby boy and they hid him in the house of God. And when he became of age, just a child. They lifted him in the temple. They anointed him king, and the nation rallied behind him. But they had a question. They said, we have now a king, but we have no weapons to defeat Athaliah, this evil woman and her armies. And the priest said, oh, yes, we do. You see, a wicked person don't go to church. They never come to the house of God. So she wouldn't know that David built warehouses of warfare that are right here in the temple. They're underground. They're in storehouses. There's tens of thousands of pieces of armory and weaponry. There's swords, spears, shields, javelins, battle axes. They're all here. And the people of God armed themselves and sharpened the swords and polished the armor and put it on. All because David realized, in triumph or tragedy, victory or defeat, get to the house of God. When I fall and fail, get me to the house of God to find strength. And when I have triumph, get me to the house of God to lay my trophies at his feet and say, it is only by you that we live, breathe, and have our being. Joash was put upon the throne because David hid away in the house of God his greatest trophies of triumph. David said in Psalms 23, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. When I come through the valley of the shadow of death, I want to be in the house of the Lord. When I walk by still waters, ultimately I still want to be in the house of the Lord. Even when God prepares a table before me in front of the people that hate me the most, take me to the house of the Lord. Then David says it like this. He says in Psalms chapter 92 in verse 13, those that be planted in the house of the Lord shall flourish in the courts of our God. Those that be planted in the house of the Lord shall flourish in the courts of our God. In other words, David is challenging you. You need to be planted in the house of God. Be there and be a part of what God's doing. Be there and celebrate in life the victories and the tragedies with the people of God. And I close with this, Psalms 27. David looked at the priest. He said to the nation, one thing have I desired of the Lord, and that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to inquire of his people. I want you to know that you belong in God's house with God's people. I know this is maybe too simple of a solution for things you're facing, but the answer is not to stay away, but it's to get in. The solution is not to withdraw, but to come closer. This is a precedent established of old times. In God's house, in God's presence, is fullness of joy. I pray that this has encouraged you and challenged you to reevaluate in your heart and in your life. Where am I running to during trials and victories? Where am I running to from my defeats and to my triumphs? All things should point us to being in the house of God. Speaking that, I want to thank you for being a part of Connect Group tonight. And to our guest, thank you so much. And we hope that you will join us soon, maybe even this Sunday, as we're going to be celebrating what God is doing through First Church campuses around the world. We have Sunday 10 a.m. service at our First Church Woodland campus, Sundays 2 p.m. at our First Church Vacaville campus. Children's ministries, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, 7 p.m. in the prospective campuses. Thank you so much for being here. I hope to see you in the house of the Lord this Sunday, where we can worship the Lord in victory together. There's going to be another great move of God's presence. Again, thank you for being here. I cannot wait to see you this Sunday as we celebrate what God is doing around the world. God bless you.